morning, everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk. And I'm very grateful to Professor Alam and the WASA team, as always. Thank you. So a lot of the times there's a focus on the SDGs, but the role of women, although it's accepted and it's seen as a very important contribution, it's not always documented or understood where their role lies and why there is a problem if we do not integrate women. And I think there's a tendency to focus hugely on the fact that although women are important, their role may not be as determinant as people would like to expect. So I'd like to ask the question, well, where are the women? They're 51% of the world is women, and yet somehow the women are not always included in all the discussions, and this is quite important. If you look at the statistics, and they're quite significant statistics, I'm going to put up just stats figures for Africa, for Europe, and for Asia. And I think what you will see is that if you look at the African statistics directly, you can see most of the figures are quite low, under 50%, but you'll see some that say 90% or 58%. What the 90% stands for is the amount of money that women generate, and they put it back into their families. So it's not personal money, it's not development money, it's money just to feed the family, keep the home going, and so on. So your income generation is driven not to necessarily towards the economy, but driven towards protection and bringing up of your family. If you then look at the European context, where with the solutions, or shall we say the involvement of women in practice, there is slightly more, you will see that the vast majority of higher positions, in particular senior executive positions, are well below 50% in most countries. In fact, it's well below 20% in a lot of countries. And if you look at managers generally, even in countries like Latvia, which has one of the highest rates of managerial roles, it is just barely under 60%. You look at Asia, where access to women to try and get into high export volume potentials or value potentials is always restricted. There's significant barriers to women being allowed to run those industries, but yet they are part of the industry. The industry would not work without the women being present. Well, which countries? This comes down to leadership. Which countries have been female-led? Well, if you look at the whole sort of map of the world, you can see that most countries have never had a female leader, so that's the grayed out zone, and yellow shows one leader. So it's really, we're quite behind. If you then look at other positions in leadership, you can see that there are lots of benchmarks, but again, the proportion in orange is what you should be looking at, is the female proportion of those positions. And you can see yet again, it's only if you come into very specific areas like public school teachers and so on, where the number of women in teaching roles is much higher. But other than that, in all the sort of other senior executive style posts, you do not have enough women. We're still very, very behind in 2024. The other thing, and I find this hugely, I come from a surgical background, you have got a really double-blind dilemma in women in leadership, in that you've got the gender stereotype that there's certain jobs that are assumed to be only for women and only for men. And to crisscross into them, women tend to have to adopt a male-like persona. In other words, they have to be quite more aggressive, more pushy, etc., which a lot of women find really difficult. And if you try and go through the empathetic route and so on, you're seen as not being able to climb up that ladder. So there is a restriction in how you can achieve those positions. And I've put this up. Now, you might remember last year there was a film called Barbie. And it's some very interesting comments came out by the actress America Ferrera, who was in this. I mean, she's a well-known women's rights activist, but I thought it was a very, very apt quote. You know, it's literally impossible to be a woman. You're beautiful and smart, and it kills you that you don't think you're good enough. And that's one of the problems we have with women, is there's an imposter syndrome feeling. And then it says you have to be extraordinary, but somehow, even when you are extraordinary, you're not always doing it right. And you can see that in a lot of female leadership positions around the world. There's always criticism. If it's not about the work the woman's doing, it's the way she's doing it, it's the way she's dressing, it's the way she looks, and so on. So factors like that really impact on why the women are not there. Now, the SDGs, well, I know we all know they're 17, but this is a very interesting group and factor. I'm just going to show you generally, and you can get this. It's available on the websites. The United Nations Women Organization in particular, you can track it down through there. But absolutely every single SDG impacts on women. There is absolutely no doubt. So if you go from the point of poverty, women earn significantly less globally. In countries where you're trying to eradicate hunger, it's the women who tend to go hungry. The children and the men tend to be more fed. It's a general principle. In countries where women die from preventable diseases, you have to think to yourself, why? You know, and often you'll ask women in community groups, why do you think you are suffering more? They'll say, well, we think if men had babies, they probably would have found a cure for us dying in childbirth. And, you know, there is something to be said for that. It's quite interesting. And then if you look at all the sort of parameters, energy provision and so on, there's an awful lot of women who just don't have that access. If you look at the other SDGs, and there are quite a few more to go here, you can look at 10, 11, 12, and so on. But in every level, and I think perhaps the one that's interesting, and I want you to keep this figure in mind, is in SDG 17, there is 1.3 trillion money that comes in to different invested in countries and communities. But yet from those countries and communities, 3.3 trillion goes out. So just bear that figure in mind. But let's look at SDG 5. So SDG 5, which is all about gender equality, one of the issues about it is that we are still striving hard to get here. And this is statistic from last year. So where they said with only 7 years remaining, 15.4% are on track, 61.5% are moderate, and 23.1% are very far off track. So we are still, you know, the vast majority is nowhere where it should be. So this is an important factor. So roughly 85% of SDG 5, which is looking at gender equality, which is pervasive and impacts on all the other issues, has been is not achievable by 2030 in theory. So why is this the problem? So I thought let's look at some of the factors that affect SDGs. Well, one of them, which affects predominantly the Horn of Africa, is female genital mutilation. Not that it's not being stopped and there is a drive to try and reduce the numbers and to drive to try and work with the women, but it does slow women down. There is a perception that the most important thing for a young girl and young woman to achieve is to have FGM in that community, because otherwise they won't get married, which then takes away their economic power and so on. So there are lots of factors. So cultural practices are relevant to this. If you then look at economic factors, well, we know that most women try and start a business, particularly in Africa, because that's the only way they can generate income. And if you then look at what access to credit they have, and remember I said investments into countries is roughly 1.3 trillion, the most women get access to globally is 320 billion. I mean, that's not a lot of money when you think of it in the scope of the population. And if you look at places like Africa, there's a 42 billion Africa gender funding gap with a long perpetual time to try and close that gap. If it then comes down to sort of common sense, and I think this quote from Jin Yong Kim is quite important, is that if and when countries value girls and women as much as boys and men, they give you greater opportunities to participate in the economy, manage incomes, own your businesses, and then extend it to other communities. Which then brings us to gender lens investing. So if you look at gender lens investing, you have to look at how you target your female groups and how you can make it possible for them to have access. So you need to advance women in finance and leadership and so on. And these are all factors you have to take into account to make the change. But where do we start? Well, we need to have building blocks. We need to positively rebuild our norms and values, increase awareness and education, renew and amend our laws, and transform critically our institutions. And by that, it's absolutely every institution you can think of. Even the United Nations is an institution we need to think of. And it's only by doing that and breaking down those gender divisions that we can move things forward. So one of the things I think is important is that to make change, you do need to do it at several levels. So you do need to look at your policies and your institutions, the women and girls themselves, and the family and the community. If you do not have those three anchors, you can't get there. Which brings us to what we call gender transformative change, which basically focuses on those impact factors. In other words, by changing those practices and bringing people in, you can make that alter. And I think this is perhaps the best way to look at it. The women and girls own it. You have, as a duty bearer, we have to make ourselves more responsive, particularly our policies and institutions. And then we need engagement and allyship from the men and the boys. You do need to all work together. It's never a single trip. In essence, if you do all of that, you end up in this sort of factor where you look at a multinational, multi-dimensional enterprise declaration, which takes into account all the factors I've mentioned in order to induce change. And that includes changing our workplace, so everything from inclusive hiring and so on, and equal pay, looking at biases. And I think this is quite important. We do tend to have so many biases. If you talk to each other, even amongst us, I suspect most people still think of doctors as a he rather than a she. And I think everybody goes, he said, and go, well, actually, it's a she. So there's a lot of biases we must look at. So confirmation bias, brilliance bias. There's an assumption brilliance is ascribed to males rather than females. Explaining things, it tends to be that if the man explains it, and so on. So these are all these biases we need to take into account. And then if we look at expectations, we need to change our expectations. So these are people who are working and they say, how much do you aspire to be in a leadership role? Well, if you have high expectations, and you can see even women with high expectations, about 60% only feel they could get there, whereas actually in men, it's closer to 70 and so on. And so the factors are still present throughout. We have to change the way we feel, how we feel empowered, how we can move forward. I think one of the things I find quite key, and this I use it in medicine, but I think you can use it everywhere else, you put the women at the center of your discourse and not on the periphery. It's not things to happen to them. They need to be the genesis of what is to happen, and they need to be key inside. And there are many ways you can do this, looking at engagement, empowerment, and so on. But increasingly, it's about education, raising the profile, giving them economic stability and individuality. Which then brings us all to how do we make that change? Well, we need to bring in the personal change and we need to bring in the collective change. And it's only by doing the two that you can get sustainability. So you need to change all those factors and bring all of those together. So without that and inducing our governments to change, you don't get change. I've already alluded to this, which is the issues about impact on women. So the perceptions of gender roles and responsibilities and how we have to change our way of thinking. So women equally should have the rights to share activity at home and outside the home. And we need to look at their roles and responsibilities differently. And looking at our duty bearers, in other words, our governments. We have to change the way we make decisions, improve our services, change our policies, and change our institutions. So essentially, if you're looking at stages of women empowerment, because that in the end is what it's about, no women and no SDGs are at the very beginning of this, where they feel increasingly powerless. But if you bring in all the other changes, you can get more women involved. And it's only in doing so that you can achieve your SDGs. Bear in mind what we've spoken about at the very beginning. And I think this is, I would say, is my ultimate goal, a world in which all women and girls live in dignity, are healthy, know and enjoy all their rights. And it's only by including all of them that we can achieve and adopt fully the SDGs. Thank you.